Havana is the capital city, largest city, province, major port, and leading commercial center of Cuba. The city proper has a population of 2.1 million inhabitants, and it spans a total of 728.26 square kilometers, making it the largest city by area, the most populous city, and the third largest metropolitan area in the Caribbean region. The city extends mostly westward and southward from the bay, which is entered through a narrow inlet and which divides into three main harbors: Marimelena, Guanabaco and Atares. The sluggish Almendez River traverses the city from south to north, entering the Straits of Florida a few miles west of the bay. The city of Havana was founded by the Spanish in the 16th century, and due to its strategic location it served as a springboard for the Spanish conquest of the continent, becoming a stopping point for the treasure-laden Spanish galleons on the crossing between the New World and the Old World. King Philip II of Spain granted Havana the title of city in 1592. Walls as well as forts were built to protect the old city. The sinking of the U.S. battleship Maine in Havana's harbor in 1898 was the immediate cause of the Spanish-American War. Contemporary Havana can essentially be described as three cities in one: Old Havana, Vedado, and the newer suburban districts. The city is the center of the Cuban government, and home to various ministries, headquarters of businesses and over 90 diplomatic offices. The current mayor is Marta Hernandez from the Communist Party of Cuba. In 2009, the city-province had the third highest income in the country. The city attracts over 1 million tourists annually. The official census for Havana reports that in 2010 the city was visited by 1,176,627 international tourists, a 20.0% increase from 2005. The historic center was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. The city is also noted for its history, culture, architecture and monuments. Etymology: most native settlements became the site of Spanish colonial cities retaining their original Taino names. The name Habana could be based upon the name of a local Taino chief, Habana. An alternate theory is that Habana is derived from the Middle Dutch word haven, referring to a harbor. History: colonial period Conquistador Diego Velázquez de Cutellar founded Havana on August 25, 1515 or 1514, on the southern coast of the island, near the present town of Surgidero de Batabano, or more likely on the banks of the Mayabeque River close to Playa Mayabeque. All attempts to found a city on Cuba's south coast failed. However, an early map of Cuba drawn in 1514 places the town at the mouth of this river. Between 1514 and 1519 the Spanish established at least two different settlements on the north coast, one of them in La Chorrera, today in the neighborhoods of Vedado and Miramar, next to the Almendez River. The town that became Havana finally originated adjacent to what was then called Puerto de Carenas, in 1519. The quality of this natural bay, which now hosts Havana's harbor, warranted this change of location. Pánfilo de Narváez gave Havana, the sixth town founded by the Spanish on Cuba, its name: San Cristobal de la Habana. The name combines San Cristobal, patron saint of Havana, and Habana, of obscure origin, possibly derived from Habana, a Native American chief who controlled that area, as mentioned by Diego Velázquez in his report to the King of Spain. Shortly after the founding of Cuba's first cities, the island served as little more than a base for the conquista of other lands. Havana began as a trading port, and suffered regular attacks by buccaneers, pirates, and French corsairs. The first attack and resultant burning of the city was by the French corsair Jacques de Sores in 1555. Such attacks convinced the Spanish crown to fund the construction of the first fortresses in the main cities, not only to counteract the pirates and corsairs, but also to exert more control over commerce with the West Indies. and to limit the extensive contrabando that had arisen due to the trade restrictions imposed by the Casa de Contratación of Seville. Ships from all over the New World carried products first to Havana, in order to be taken by the fleet to Spain. The thousands of ships gathered in the city's bay also fueled Havana's agriculture and manufacture, since they had to be supplied with food, water, and other products needed to traverse the ocean. On December 20, 1592, King Philip II of Spain granted Havana the title of city. Later on, the city would be officially designated as Key to the New World and Rampart of the West Indies by the Spanish crown. In the meantime, efforts to build or improve the defensive infrastructures of the city continued. Havana expanded greatly in the 17th century. New buildings were constructed from the most abundant materials of the island, mainly wood, combining various Iberian architectural styles, as well as borrowing profusely from Canarian characteristics. In 1649 a very fatal epidemic brought from Cartagena in Colombia affected a third of the population of Havana. By the middle of the 18th century, Havana had more than 70,000 inhabitants, and was the third largest city in the Americas, ranking behind Lima and Mexico City but ahead of Boston and New York. During the 18th century, Havana was the most important of the Spanish ports because it had facilities where ships could be refitted, and by 1740, it had become Spain's largest and most active shipyard and only dry dock in the New World. The city was captured by the British during the 7 Years' War. The episode began on June 6, 1762, when at dawn, a British fleet, comprising more than 50 ships and a combined force of over 11,000 men of the Royal Navy and Army, sailed into Cuban waters and made an amphibious landing east of Havana. The British immediately opened up trade with their North American and Caribbean colonies, causing a rapid transformation of Cuban society. Less than a year after Havana was seized, the Peace of Paris was signed by the three warring powers, thus ending the 7 Years' War. The treaty gave Britain Florida in exchange for the city of Havana on the recommendation of the French, who advised that declining the offer could result in Spain losing Mexico and much of the South American mainland to the British. After regaining the city, the Spanish transformed Havana into the most heavily fortified city in the Americas. Construction began on what was to become the fortress of San Carlos de la Cabana, the third biggest Spanish fortification in the New World after Fort San Cristobal and Fort San Felipe del Morro, both in San Juan, Puerto Rico. On January 15, 1796, the remains of Christopher Columbus were transported to the island from Santo Domingo. They rested here until 1898, when they were transferred to Seville's Cathedral, after Spain's loss of Cuba. As trade between Caribbean and North American states increased in the early 19th century, Havana became a flourishing and fashionable city. Havana's theaters featured the most distinguished actors of the age, and prosperity among the burgeoning middle class led to expensive new classical mansions being erected. During this period, Havana became known as the Paris of the Antilles. In 1837, the first railroad was constructed, a 51-kilometer stretch between Havana and Bajucal, which was used for transporting sugar from the Valley of Guinness to the harbor. With this, Cuba became the fifth country in the world to have a railroad, and the first Spanish-speaking country. Throughout the century, Havana was enriched by the construction of additional cultural facilities, such as the Taken Theatre, one of the most luxurious in the world. The fact that slavery was legal in Cuba until 1886 led to Southern American interest, including a plan by the Knights of the Golden Circle to create a Golden Circle, with a 1,200-mile radius centered on Havana. After the Confederate States of America were defeated in the American Civil War in 1865, many former slaveholders continued to run plantations by moving to Havana. In 1863, the city walls were knocked down so that the metropolis could be enlarged. At the end of the 19th century, Havana witnessed the final moments of Spanish colonialism in the Americas. Republican period and post-revolution. The 20th century began with Havana, and therefore Cuba, under occupation by the United States. The U.S. occupation officially ended when Thomas Estrada Palmer, first president of Cuba, took office on 20 May 1902. During the Republican period, from 1902 to 1959, the city saw a new era of development. Cuba recovered from the devastation of war to become a well-off country, with the third largest middle class in the hemisphere. Apartment buildings to accommodate the new middle class, as well as mansions for the Cuban tycoons, were built at a fast pace. Numerous luxury hotels, casinos and nightclubs were constructed during the 1930s to serve Havana's burgeoning tourist industry. In the 1930s, organized crime characters were not unaware of Havana's nightclub and casino life, and they made their inroads in the city. Santo Traficant, Jr. took the roulette wheel at the San Souci Casino. Meyer Lansky directed the Hotel Habana Riviera, with Lucky Luciano at the Hotel National Casino. At the time, Havana became an exotic capital of appeal and numerous activities ranging from marinas, Grand Prix car racing, musical shows and parks. Havana achieved the title of being the Latin American city with the biggest middle-class population per capita, simultaneously accompanied by gambling and corruption where gangsters and stars were known to mix socially. During this era, Havana was generally producing more revenue than Las Vegas, Nevada. In 1958, about 300,000 American tourists visited the city. After the revolution of 1959, the new regime under Fidel Castro promised to improve social services, public housing, and official buildings. Nevertheless, after Castro's abrupt expropriation of all private property and industry under a strong communist model backed by the Soviet Union followed by the U.S. embargo, shortages that affected Cuba in general hit Havana especially hard. By 1966 to 1968, the Cuban government had nationalized all privately owned business entities in Cuba, down to certain kinds of small retail forms of commerce. A severe economic downturn occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Soviet subsidies ended, representing billions of dollars which the Soviet Union had given the Cuban government. Many believed that Havana's Soviet-backed regime would soon vanish, as happened to the Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe. However, contrary to events in Europe, Havana's communist regime continued during the 1990s. After many years of prohibition, the communist government increasingly turned to tourism for new financial revenue, and has allowed foreign investors to build new hotels and develop the hospitality industry. In Old Havana, effort has also gone into rebuilding for tourist purposes, and a number of streets and squares have been rehabilitated. But Old Havana is a large city, and the restoration efforts concentrate in all on less than 10% of its area. Havana Stock Exchange c. 1920. Capitolio National in 1929. Museum of Fine Arts at the Palace of the Asturian c. 1920. Grand National Theatre at the Palace of the Galician c. 1920. Geography. Havana lies on the northern coast of Cuba, south of the Florida Keys, where the Gulf of Mexico joins the Atlantic Ocean. The city extends mostly westward and southward from the bay, which is entered through a narrow inlet and which divides into three main harbors: Marimelena, Guanabaco, and Atares. The sluggish Almendez River traverses the city from south to north, entering the Straits of Florida a few miles west of the bay. The low hills on which the city lies rise gently from the deep blue waters of the straits. A noteworthy elevation is the 200-foot-high limestone ridge that slopes up from the east and culminates in the heights of La Cabana and El Morro, the sites of colonial fortifications overlooking the eastern bay. Another notable rise is the hill to the west that is occupied by the University of Havana and the Prince's Castle. Outside the city, higher hills rise on the west and east. Climate: Havana, like much of Cuba, has a tropical climate that is tempered by the island's position in the belt of the trade winds and by the warm offshore currents. Under the Köppen climate classification, Havana has a tropical savanna climate. Average temperatures range from 22 degrees Celsius in January and February to 28 degrees Celsius in August. The temperature seldom drops below 10 degrees Celsius. The lowest temperature was 1 degree Celsius in Santiago de Las Vegas, Boyas. The lowest recorded temperature in Cuba was 32 degrees Fahrenheit in Hawanie.JPG province. Rainfall is heaviest in June and October and lightest from December through April, averaging 1,200 mm annually. The table below lists temperature averages.